Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and we have been talking about language in the past week or so. And today's lecture, I wanted to talk about bilingualism. Now, bilingualism has become more of a norm than an exception nowadays. You will hardly come across a person who speaks or understands only one language. Even in places where, even in sometimes in remote places, you will see that you will assume that this person probably knows only the local language, the Hindi or Tamil or Telugu or whatever. But you will see most of these places are also kind of getting affected by some different language or the other. Suppose for a lot of people, they would be exposed to some words of English or the other. So the idea is, more often than not, people are now getting used to speaking and understanding more than the one language that is their mother tongue. So let us in this lecture try and understand some of the basic issues related to people who speak two languages and so on and so forth. So actually, what is the deal about being a bilingual? What is a bilingual person? Is a bilingual person a sum of two monolinguals, a monolingual in Hindi and a monolingual in English? Combine them and does it become a bilingual who speaks both Hindi and English? Is it like that? Or if I ask a different question, how must these bilingual people be storing words of two languages? It's easy to imagine that all of this could get mixed up. You go to the market and you want to buy a fruit, and the fruit is an apple, and you know that apple is called apple in English and seb in Hindi, and it might also be possible that a third language where the name is something different. So doesn't it all really get mixed up in the brain? How is it organized? Are there two concepts and two different words, or are they just one concept linked to two different words? So the same concept of apple is linked to seb and apple, or let us say there are two different concepts. So seb is something really different in your head and apple is something really different in your head. Think about it. We are trying to we will in the course of today's lecture try and look at these different kind of possibilities. Another question that I could ask you is that how does a bilingual, being a bilingual, speak only in one language most of the time? Because for example, I am a bilingual and I am speaking in English at the moment, but I know Hindi as well. So is it that at the back of my head I am speaking Hindi as well, or how am I being able to speak in English selectively and not Hindi? Because I know both the languages, and whatever I am saying, I am capable of saying that in both my languages. So these are some of the very interesting questions that come to the mind when you talk about bilingualism. And in today's lecture, we will try and just traverse through some of these questions a bit superficially, basically because we don't really want to give all of the time to language stuff. Today is probably the last lecture on language, but still, let us try and survey this landscape a little bit. Now, if you remember, when I was talking about words, I told you that lexical knowledge is two things. It is concepts, that is the meaning part, and it is sound or form, that is the form part. So becoming a bilingual must involve learning sounds or phonological labels for concepts. So basically, you should have two kinds of sounds or two kinds of phonological labels for one kind of concept. This is one of the assumptions that we will begin with. Now, how are these two labels connected to the same concept, or how are these two labels connected to each other in your memory? Suppose I am beginning to learn English at this point in time. How am I doing it? Am I learning English for every concept that I know of, or what I am doing is I have a concept of the the apple, let us say there is a fruit, and I have a concept of that in Hindi, and what I am just doing is I am linking this concept to the word in English. Suppose for example, I can show you I have this concept of this fruit, and I know that this is referred to as seb in my language. What I could do is I could actually either link it to apple, or I could make these connections. So this is one of the things that people have thought about, and there are two hypotheses which were given to explain this. One of them is the word association model. The word association model basically thinks that language learners are linking L1 labels to L2 labels. So, what they are basically doing is they are not making this connection here, but they are making this connection. So, this is basically what the word association model talks about. Another model, that is the conceptual mediation model. The conceptual mediation model basically says that we do not really need to make this link between these two phonological labels, we much rather make the link from the concept to labels of both the languages. So, the concept mediation model says that the concept itself is connected to phonological labels of both the languages. This is how the word association and the concept mediation model shape up. So, you have the first language labels and the second language labels. You will see that the concepts are not connected to the second language labels, they are basically connected just to the first language labels, which are connected to the second language labels. This is the word association model. Then you have the conceptual mediation model, which says that the concepts are connected to both the first language labels and the second language labels. Now, obviously, one would like to test these predictions. So, these predictions were tested, and the hypothesis was that according to the word association model, translation from L1 to L2 should be easier than picture naming in L2. Just if you look at this, if you have to translate from L1 to L2, you do not really need to go from the concept, you can directly go to the L2. Or either ways, if you have to come from L2 to L1, again you do not really need to go through conceptual model, you have to go from the first language label. According to the concept, on the other hand, both of these things should take the same time. If you are translating from L1 to L2, or you are translating it, or basically you are just picture naming in L2, both cases you are kind of looking for the link between the conceptual concept and the L2 labels. So, let us see what happens. They did this experiment on Chinese English, very high proficient bilinguals who are good in both English and Chinese, and they asked them to do translation. They found that translation from L1 to L2 takes the same time as compared to L2 picture naming. Now, this basically led to this assumption, or this basically kind of really established that the conceptual mediation model might be the correct one. Potter and colleagues basically summarize these findings and other similar findings as the hierarchical model of organization of L1 and L2 words. Because they are saying is that knowledge associated to words is distributed across different subcomponent systems, L1 labels, L2 labels, and the concepts. Now, if you really think of it, people do not only translate from L1 to L2, they also translate from L2 to L1. So, there are both forward translations and backward translations. According to conceptual mediation model, again if you look here, both are mediated by the conceptual module, and both should take the same time, both are concept mediated. Judith Kroll and colleagues, they proposed a different model building on the earlier model, and they named it the revised hierarchical model. The revised hierarchical model of bilingualism says that L1 labels connect directly to L2 labels, but the connection from L1 to L2 is slightly weaker than that from L2 to L1. I will talk about why is this important. So, in this case it should be important, it should be possible to translate from L2 to L1 without passing through the conceptual mediation store. Also, L1 to L2 translation should follow, however, the same route as the concept mediation model had predicted through the conceptual store. Indeed, people have found supporting evidence that indicates that L2 to L1 translation is faster than L1 to L2 translation. We will see how this model looks. So, if you see, this is the revised hierarchical model by Kroll and Stewart in 1994, and you see the conceptual links are stronger between L1 and the conceptual store, and the links between L1 and L2 is slightly weaker, but the link between L2 to L1 is slightly stronger. So, if you have to translate from L2 to L1, you do not really need to go through the conceptual link store, but if you need to translate from L1 to L2, you might need to go from the conceptual mediation store. Now, this is basically how the model predicted and how it looks like. There is some more evidence about this, let us look at that. Other experiments have investigated the effects of semantic factors on translation direction, whether you are going from L1 to L2 or you are going from L2 to L1. Now, I have just remembered that I have probably not really said a bit about L1 and L2. L1 is basically your first language, it is the mother tongue, so to speak. It is basically the first language that the child masters or learns when the child is very small, when the child is born. L2 is basically any acquired language that a child acquires at different stages in life. It could sometimes be simultaneously with the first language, suppose somebody is born into a bilingual parenthood, or suppose a language that a child learns in school or later in occupation, and so on and so forth. Now, coming back, the hypothesis basically L1 to L2 translation is easier, or L2 to L1 translation is more difficult, or the other way around, is basically because of this asymmetric connection strength that this model is talking about. You see that the connection strength between L1 to L2 is weaker than the connection strength between L2 to L1. Now, because we are talking about this asymmetric connection strength, coming up with a word in L2 should be more affected by semantic factors than translating from L2 to L1, okay, because it is going to require that much more effort. So, they wanted to test this in one of the experiments. So, in one of the experiments, subjects basically are given list of words, L1 words to translate into L2 and L2 words to translate from L1. A block of words may be from the same semantic category either, or they could be from different semantic categories. I could give you all fruits, or I could give you a mixed list which has fruits and animals both. Now, the revised hierarchical model would predict that semantic interference will be found in forward translation going from L1 to L2, because the link is weaker. Remember, you can just look here, than backward translation. Backward translation from L2 to L1 should be easier and should be less affected by these semantic interferences. Indeed, they found that semantically related words was more trouble for forward translation, that is going from L1 to L2, but not really from L2 to L1, because those links were much stronger. So, again you have this evidence which basically kind of supports what the revised hierarchical model says. Now, we have talked about how these things would be connected in brain. Let us now talk a little bit about whether or not both of these languages are active at the same time. If these languages are active at the same time, if they are simultaneously activated, whether there is competition between the two languages for speaking and for comprehending, or whether they are having peaceful coexistence and everything is fine and stuff. Let us see. They basically say that there is a lot of competition between the two languages. So, when bilinguals are listening to speech, lexical entries from both the languages are competing for activation and selection. Also, when bilinguals are speaking, words from both the languages are competing for being selected and executed through the speech apparatus. Now, this competition, however, they say can be dependent upon how well this person knows the second language. Suppose somebody has learned the second language at a very early age. People now send their children to English medium convent schools since the beginning. So, these children are acquiring the second language very early in their lives. However, some of us might not be going to these English medium schools so early in age, but we might be forced to learn English. Suppose when we pass our high school exams, or we pass our intermediate exam, and then we join a particular course. Suppose a lot of people take admission in a particular college, and the college is English medium, however their entire education has been in Hindi medium. So, these people are now mastering the second language much later in life. So, their proficiency in English is also going to be a little bit less as compared to the proficiency in English of these people who started learning English much earlier in life. So, fluent bilinguals generally will not really have a problem handling this competition. They will be able to seamlessly shift between using Hindi and English and going forward translations and backward translations at will. They will rarely make code switching mistakes, and they will say, for example, they will not end up using words from a different language when talking to audience of who wants to listen to a different. Suppose, for example, somebody is speaking in their class and they want to speak in English. The fluent bilinguals will be able to speak in English even though their mother tongue is equally strong, be it Hindi or Bangla or Tamil or whatever. The less fluent bilinguals, however, would sometimes make these kind of mistakes. Even if they were supposed to speak in English, because they are not as fluent in English, they might start using words from the mother language, which is either in Hindi or English or Hindi or Tamil or anything. Also, but fluent bilinguals even sometimes can make this error when they are highly aroused, highly emotional. Some people, when they are highly emotionally distressed or they are under influence of alcohol, etc., sometimes they would in a high aroused state will make these kind of errors. Such errors are more common when bilinguals speak in their less dominant language. When they are speaking English, they might, you can see that they might start using words from Hindi, not the other way around. Sometimes the other way around as well though. So, is there some evidence, is there some experimental evidence about the simultaneous activation of two languages? So, one of the evidences I could point out was the cognate effect. Now, cognate is basically a word in one language that has a counterpart having a similar meaning and form in the other language, but it is spelt or pronounced identically. Okay, it's the same word. For example, piano is a word in both Spanish and English. In picture naming studies, where you just show pictures to participants and ask them to name them, or in translation studies, when you ask participants to translate from one language to the other language, bilinguals have been found to respond to faster to cognates, because cognate, the word is activating both their language banks, both their phonological stores or something like that. Now, N400 has been is a component of ERP. If talked about what ERP is in one of the earlier courses, but ERP is basically a component that is that indexes your brain activity. It's an electrical component measured by EEG, which basically gives the sense of whether something is semantically integratable or not. Now, N400 is a component that is smaller for cognates than for non-cognates, because there might be a possibility that the cognate word has candidate activation in the second language. Also, the cognate advantage occurs when the bilingual is operating under monolingual task conditions as well, where only one of the two languages is relevant to the task, and when the speaker is operating under task conditions where responding in only one language is permitted. Irrespective of whether the response is made in the weaker language or the dominant language, cognate advantage is expected there as well. Suppose I am giving you a task and I am telling you that you have to name all of these pictures in Hindi. Suppose there is a cognate word that has a similar meaning in English, but the pronunciation might be a little bit difficult. Or so when such a cognate comes, you will experience that cognate advantage. You will name the cognate faster than all the other words who did not have cognates. So, that is the cognate advantage. The cognate advantage is also found to be much stronger when there is high similarity between the orthography and phonology of the two languages, because the meaning is same. If the orthography and the phonology and the form is same as well, obviously the advantage will be magnified. It diminishes, however, when the similarity in pronunciation is decreased. Suppose there is a very different pronunciation of that word in a different language, then what will happen is, because of the pronunciation, you will already get the clue that this is from my L1 or this is from my L2, and then the advantage of multiple activation will not be there. So, bilingual speakers are also less likely to experience the tip of the tongue phenomena for cognates than for non-cognates. Also, the cognate advantage, however, tells us that both the languages of the bilingual are active at the same time and almost all the time. There is another class of words that kind of give us some evidence about simultaneous activation of the two languages. These words are referred to as interlingual homographs. These words look exactly the same in the two languages, however, they might mean very different things. For example, the word chef means boss in German, but it means a cook in English. Okay. So, bilinguals have been shown to respond very slowly to these interlingual homographs, because they are kind of trying to compete, trying to suppress one of the two meanings when they are speaking it. Obviously, if you are speaking in a particular context, you probably might be going with one or the other meaning, but even if you are going to name in that meaning, the other meaning is also kind of activated and it is competing for selection. These interlingual homographs behave like ambiguous words, because the visual form of the word automatically is activating the multiple meanings from the two languages, and hence, as I was saying, creates a scenario for competition. Now, are there only problems coming out of this simultaneous activation? Not really, because as far as language input is concerned, sometimes the help of prosodic and phonological cues, we have seen in the language acquisition lectures that prosodic and phonological cues are very important from the so these prosodic and phonological cues from the spoken language, listeners may be able to activate only one of the two. So, they might use these cues to suppress one of the two languages completely and just keep activated the language that is relevant to that scenario. However, again, this is not really completely helpful, there are other evidences which have shown that people are activating both the languages. So, when bilinguals are listening to words, matching candidates from both the languages are activated and some kind of selection there is required, okay, to be able to come up with only the relevant candidate according to that scenario. Also, as you can see, activation is not really respecting the distinction between the two languages. When you see a concept, or you are seeing a picture, or you are talking to somebody, both words, words from L1 and L2 are both getting equally activated. So, let us kind of look at some more evidence about this simultaneous activation. So, Murray and Spivey and Hirsch in 2003, they were testing these Russian English bilinguals, and by giving them instructions in either in Russian or in English. So, what they were doing is they were actually presenting to them a particular kind of setup where they would see that 3 or 4 pictures were there on a screen, 4 pictures are there suppose, and their instruction would either be given in English and in or in Russian. So, the idea was, suppose there are 4 things. There is a stamp, stamp basically is referred to as a marku in Russian, and there is an actual marker, and there is a marble, and there are some other there is one more other thing. Now, they were actually either given an instruction in English saying click on the marker, or they were given an instruction in Russian saying polori marku. Now, the idea is that because they are, as soon as they are listening from click on the marker, because marker till mark, it is also going, it is very close phonological neighbor of marku, which is the stamp. A lot of the times they would basically be looking at the stamp as well. So, this is basically a demonstration of the fact that because of the phonological activation, because of the phonological neighborhood, the participant is getting distracted towards the stamp as well, because we are talking about Russian English bilinguals who are both proficient in Russian, who are proficient in both English and Russian. Now, if the participants, because they are listening this in English, if the participants are using this instructional cue to suppress Russian completely, then they should not have looked at the stamp. But we see that these participants were not really able to switch off Russian even though the instruction was in English, and that is why they were definitely getting distracted with and distracted by looking at the stamp. So, in a sense there is simultaneous activation in spite of whatever the instruction language is. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that two languages have shared lexical representation. Both the languages of the bilingual have shared lexical representations. In short, listening to words from either language will activate words from the other language and vice versa, and these phonology to meaning connections will be activated in both the languages. Now, these activations sometimes exceed the minimal threshold required to control behavior that would lead to interference and production problems. Imagine, if you remember, I was talking about the cohort model in the language production class. Remember, in place of the cohort in the monolingual setting which has matching words from the same language, there is another parallel cohort from the other language as well. Now, you do not really have to choose just from your language, but also choose from the other language as well, or suppress distractors from both the languages just to be able to select a target word which is either of the two languages. Now, evidence for this is basically came up in a particular task where bilinguals were basically asked to do some kind of target word identification, and their target word identification was found to depend not only on how frequent a word is in its own language, but also what the frequency of this is in the second language, and also how many neighbors it had in the second language. So, if there is a word, it has some neighbors in L1, it has some neighbors in L2, both of these neighbors will compete for selection with this target word, and that will basically add to the time that you take in producing this word finally. So, they did this cross linguistic priming study where this the word was rope. Rope is said as touw in Dutch. Participants responded much faster to touw when it was preceded by ROAP, which is a phonological neighbor to ROPE, rope. So, even if you are saying ROAP and you are looking at presenting it as a phonological neighbor, the word touw is getting activated. So, you see cross linguistic priming is happening here. However, it is not really necessary that both the languages are active all the time. I mean, there has to be some way in which one of the two languages can be suppressed. So, it has been shown the more dominant language L1 is rather immune to the influences that are coming to from L2. So, L1 to L2 influence is much more, because again L1 is the language that you acquired early in life, you have practiced it more often than your L2, etc., etc. L2 however is something that you have acquired more recently, so this one will be weaker. In that sense, the influence from L1 to L2 will be slightly stronger as compared to the influence from L2 to L1. Now, this is just a hypothesis probably at this point, and they wanted to test this. So, English French bilinguals, first language L1 is English, second language L2 is French. English French bilinguals named English words that had French enemies. So, they were naming English words which has competitors in French. French words orthographically similar, but they are pronounced differently although, or control words which had no enemies. So, I am as a English French bilingual, I am naming something in English, and basically the words I am going to name either will have a enemy in French, a very closely activated word, or it will not have an enemy in French. And the sequence was, first English words were named, no problems, then French words were named, now you see French is activated, then again English words are named. It was found that the second block when I was naming English was much slower than the first block, because just prior to the second block French has been activated by me, because I was naming in French. So, this cross-lingual activation is there and is playing an important part. Now, all of this is in comprehension. This also happens in production as well. So, if you remember the levels model of speech production, there was a concept and then you selected the lemma and then you started with phonological encoding. Now, for bilinguals, the assumption is of a shared conceptual representation, but there has to be a diversion at the lemma stage. So, activation basically is spreading automatically throughout the network of the associated lemmas and phonological representations as soon as the conceptual representations are getting activated. So, the idea is that everything is getting activated, but from the lemma stage onwards language specific activation should be there. What does this imply? Even if the bilingual selects the correct lemma, there might be phonological activations spread to the second language of the bilingual. So, what happens is, whether this concept lemma phonological encoding is happening in a serial fashion, or all three can be operating at the same point in a cascaded sort of a manner. Cascaded is basically activation at one level will inspire activation at all the other levels. So, then you have that competition and interference might happen at any of the three levels. So, Karamazov wanted to test it, he tested it through the picture word interference task. It was found that bilingual pay attention to a picture while trying to ignore a simultaneously presented distractor. So, this was basically the task. They had to name a particular picture, but there was a simultaneously presented distractor as there also that has to be, that was spoken, and they had to ignore it. So, they did this study with Dutch English bilinguals, and the task was that participants were trying to name pictures using the English names, words like mountain, while they were listening to distractor stimuli which could be phonologically or semantically similar to the picture name. So, if they have to name mountain and the picture is of a mountain, they could either listen to a distractor in mouth, which is English distractor, or mau, which basically means a sleeve, but is a phonological distractor in Dutch, or valley, which is a distractor is in English, but is semantically related, or dal, which is a distractor in Dutch, but is exactly the name of mountain in Dutch. It was found, again I will just repeat it, they have to name mountain in English, and they could have phonological distractors or semantic distractors. Phonological distractors is mouth or mau, English and Dutch. Semantic distractors valley or dal, English and Dutch. Bilingual speakers named the target mountain, target picture mountain, much faster when the distractor was phonologically similar, and much slower when the distractor was semantically similar. So, in some sense the interference is probably happening at the semantic stage, that is what is slowing this down. Now, again I showed you some of the evidence of simultaneous activation and competition and so on and so forth. I think I have made my point that there is this competition going on, and if this competition is going on, it needs some kind of control. Some people have offered that bilinguals probably might have a switch, they switch to one language and they switch to the other language when the scenario is very different. A lot of language switching studies have been investigating whether there is indeed a switch like this. So, they did this Mutter and Allport in 1999. They used Arabic numerals and they asked participants to switch between naming them in either in English or in Arabic. they found naming from L2 to L1 was harder as compared to switching to name from L1 to L2. Now, why would this be? Why would it be that if I am speaking in English, coming back to Arabic will be difficult, if I am speaking in Arabic, going back to English is easier? Now, there is basically this kind of an effect is referred to as the involuntary persistence of task sets, because one of the tasks is easier or stronger, this task persists. Now, the idea is here the asymmetric switching cost is because English or my first Arabic or my first language is stronger. So, if I have suppressed this and I am speaking in English now, when I have to come back from English to Arabic, I have to take away this stronger suppression. That is why this will become difficult. If I am speaking in Arabic and I have just suppressed the weaker language, that is English, coming back from Arabic to English will be easier because I just have to take away the weaker suppression. So, this is again one of the explanations. For this, basically there are different kinds of models proposed for control of languages. This is basically the reason for asymmetric suppression. So, they found this asymmetric suppression, and this was a very interesting finding that kind of governed a lot of consequent research on language switching in bilingualism. So, because this is there, they also eventually came up with particular kinds of models that were talking about control of the two languages in bilingualism. I will just discuss two models again rather briefly, because it is not really a major part of this course, but one of these models is called the bilingual interactive activation model. I will talk about a slightly recent version of it. This is the BIA plus model, which was given by Ton Dijkstra and Walter van Uwen in 1998. Now, the BIA plus model basically incorporates a level of representation that encodes which language is most activated at that point in time. So, for a Dutch English bilingual, when listening to Dutch, the top down excitation and inhibition will help keep Dutch lexical phonological representations more active than those of English. Also, the activation of the other language will be completely precluded. So, the idea is that bilingual speakers would be able to switch from one language to another as soon as they recognize that when a word from the non-target language is coming. So, as soon as I am a bilingual and I am kind of receiving words, as soon as I see that a word in Dutch is coming, I will completely switch to Dutch and start speaking in Dutch. As soon as a word in English is coming, I will come back, switch back to English and start speaking in English. So, this kind of model assumes largely that a unified phonological and lexical system would operate, where component representations are influenced by higher level control structures. Let me show you how this model looks. So, you see that there are feature level, letter level and word level representations, much as you would have seen in the trace model I talked about earlier, but there is a higher level which is the language node level, which has Dutch and English, and you will see the connection from Dutch to English words is inhibitory, and connection from English to Dutch words is also inhibitory. So, the idea is this is where there is a lot of control is exercised on which language basically one has to speak in. So, BIA plus model predicts that any particular input to the system will activate multiple potential matching candidates from both the languages, and partially activated representations from both the languages will compete. This competition will basically be resolved by the higher level language structures. Another model which basically talks about this aspect of control a little bit more directly is called the David Green's model of inhibitory control. Now, David Green's inhibitory control model proposes that a set of language specific processes and general cognitive skills basically determine how the bilingual responds in the variety of language tasks. So, this model basically takes the view that performance of bilinguals in different tasks will basically vary according to the task parameters. So, they propose an inhibitory control system that includes a goal monitoring mechanism and a supervisory attentional system. So, a goal monitoring system and SAS that interact with the language specific systems that are carrying out the current task. Suppose the task is picture naming, or let us say the task is responding to the semanticity of pictures in English and Hindi. Suppose they belong to same semantic category or different semantic category. So, depending upon the task that I am doing, the task specific system or the supervisory attentional system will shift my attention from one language to the other language. All of these things will interact with the lemma and lexeme representations that reflect knowledge of L1 and L2. language switching costs can be incurred because of changes in the goal status or the language task schema. So, the idea is when the task requires me to switch from one language to the other language, I have to switch the task setting from that of English to let us say Dutch, or from English to Hindi or whatsoever. Now, different kinds of errors can occur if the SAS is not functioning properly and it is causing inadvertent change in task schema. Suppose for example, I am emotionally highly aroused and the supervisory attentional system somehow automatically shifts my attention to the second language and I start speaking the second language. So, those kind of errors can be there. Now, the SAS also has been found to involve in voluntary changes in the language task. Suppose for example, there is a free language switching task and I am free to name in either in L1 or in L2. So, such as switching from L2 to L1, in fact what will happen is that the brain regions that are associated with executive control, inhibition of response, activation of response, selection of response and attention, they will show different degrees of activation when shifting different languages. Now, an advantage of this model which talks of a task schema, language task schema and supervisory attentional system and a goal specific system, the advantage is that it kind of explains how bilingualism, how bilinguals can perform different tasks with a set of language inputs, and it kind of also explains how phenomena like switch cost and unwanted language intrusions will occur. So, the inhibitory control model in that sense explains why adult L2 learners tend to master lexical semantics better than L2 syntax or grammar, because all of these are happening at the word level. So, here you can actually look at the inhibitory control model as given by Green. You will see that there is this bilingual lexicosemantic system which is connected to the language task schema, which is basically sensitive to what kind of task is there. Then the language task schema is connected to the supervisory attentional system, which is basically diverting my attention to what kind of task I have to do, and this is connected to G, which is the goal directed schema. So, what is the goal of the task? What is it that the task requires me to do? Also, there is a conceptualizer, which is again the meaning portion of this model. So, basically what is happening is that this kind of model is taking into account not only the final goal of the task, it is also taking into account how do you need to switch from one language to the other language in order to complete the task. So, again you saw both of these models, the BIA plus model and the inhibitory control model, and kind of tells us that obviously bilingualism requires efforts, these kind of arrangements to exist for bilingual speakers to be able to perform almost seamlessly across their both languages. Obviously, scenarios of competition would lead to some kind of rewards, something you have been doing over and over again, some difficult task you have been achieving over and over again might lead to some kind of advantages. So, it has also been shown that bilinguals practice with handling competition between the two languages often leads to benefits linked with executive control capabilities like response innovation, response planning, task switching on completely unrelated tasks as compared to language tasks. So, it has also been shown across a range of studies that bilinguals have very good practice in suppressing irrelevant information. If you give a particular kind of a distractor suppression task to bilingual, and the task is suppose you have to click on the red circle, and there are many distractors which are green circles, blue circles, etc., or red squares, bilingual probably would be easier. A bilingual person would probably find it easier to suppress other distractors and perform better in the goal selection task. There are specific tasks such as the Simon task and the ANT task, which kind of really require these kind of executive capabilities, and it has been shown that bilinguals have performed at these tasks much better. Also, so taking together all of these findings, we can say that bilinguals have performed much better on monolingual, much better than monolinguals on incongruent trials, when there is a kind of a response compatibility issue, and they basically show better ability to ignore irrelevant distractors, irrelevant information at all age levels. However, it has also been shown that this advantage might be modality dependent. Suppose you are doing a visual task and you have to suppress distractors in visual modality is easier. Suppose if you are doing a visual task and you have to suppress distractors in the auditory modality, that might be a bit difficult. So, this is I think all from me about bilingualism. I have tried to give you a flavor of whatever the different issues in bilingualism are, and at the end tell you a little bit about the fact that bilingualism might be advantageous.